Okay, thank you everybody for sticking around. You already know Sarah. Lael, would you just quickly introduce yourself? I'm worried I won't get your title right.
Yeah, I'm Lael Gilbert. I'm a public communications specialist. Hello. Okay, that's better. Thank you. I'm Lael Gilbert. I'm a public communications specialist. I've been at USU for a really long time. Mark Brunson was my major professor back in '99. And I've been here off and on since then doing different projects. And I had one of those circuitous routes to science communication. But that is what I do full time now. I do all sorts of communication, but mostly writing.
And yeah, Matthew, please.
I'm Matthew LaPlante. I'm a associate professor of journalism in the Department of Communication here at Utah State University. A few years ago, I got a little bored with my life, so I went back to school to study climate science. And last year, 2 years ago now, a year and a half ago, earned my PhD in climate science. I am also the host of a show on Utah Public Radio called Undisciplined. We take a deep dive with a different scientist from a different discipline every week and talk about what they're discovering and why it inspires them. And in my other free time, I write and co-write and ghostwrite books about science.
Awesome. So I am basically going to give these guys something to talk about, and we'll listen. If you got questions, don't be shy, raise your hand. Jump in, and we'll see how long the conversation goes. And I might ask a second question if there's still time. So my first question is about what science communication means in the age of TikTok, in the age of new media, digital media. When I came here to USU, science communication meant that if I wrote a paper that I thought someone might be interested in, I'd work with someone like Lael, and we'd write a press release about the paper and publish it, and that was it. And these days, there's so many other options. There's so many other media. There's all these video options. So I guess for me, it looks like there's lots of opportunities there, but there's also potentially dangers or risks because the medium is the message, right? The video doesn't necessarily lend itself to thinking the same way that a written press release does. So I guess that's my very broad topic for you guys to discuss. What should we be doing in the new media age? What are the opportunities? What are the risks?
Well, I'd be happy to start because I love the question, to what end? And I think that's where you should always start. No matter the medium, you need to ask what are you hoping to accomplish with your communication? And so my approach is very practical, applied. I did graduate from College of Natural Resources here, but I don't consider myself a scientist. I consider myself a consumer of science more. And I don't really think that although the vehicles have changed drastically, I still don't think the manner of communicating science has changed that much. And I was trying to think about, like, in preparation for this, what works and what doesn't work. And I think it's all built on trust, no matter what medium you start with, and empathy. So that's kind of where I wanted to start.
I'll echo trust. I think we actually start from a really good starting place. And Sarah shared the slide of how many Americans trust science. And when the most recent surveys have come out showing a little bit of dip in that, we all focused on that dip. We are so focused on that dip. Man, find me any other group of human beings that we trust as much as scientists. You know, I mean, yeah, we should be concerned. We should think about what's happening, why that dip exists, but we're in such a great place already. Americans don't agree about anything, but they agree in large part that scientists are looking out for their best interests and that they're intelligent people and apparently also that they're bad communicators. But this is a great place to start from because we have those other things. And now, like, let's just build up that communication part. And the medium to me doesn't matter so much. It absolutely sets limitations, but the medium has always set limitations. We didn't have some golden era in which scientists were good at communicating. That never happened. Scientific papers have, from the time, I mean, like you can go back and you can find evidence of people complaining about how ridiculous science papers are, all the way back to the earliest scientific papers. We've never been really good at that. So this idea that like, well, the medium has changed, and so now we're really screwed because, they're not gonna, it's not the right mechanism for making that communication. There isn't a right mechanism. I think we can all sort of absolve ourselves of this thought that there's a good way, and then we're going to try to figure out how to make these other ways acceptable. These other ways all have great potential. If you haven't seen it already, I want to Peter just said like video is not like necessarily the best way to convey this stuff. I want to draw your attention to Emily Zong's new project. She's does this YouTube series called Rabbit Hole. These are long form deep dives into questions, interesting questions about the world that scientists are answering. And her page views are ridiculous high. She's paying herself and a staff with it. And these are 20 and 30-minute videos. People are engaged for that entire time. That medium works. It can work. TikTok can work. I haven't figured it out yet, but it can work. I don't want to figure it out, but it can work. I come from a print background, back in the days when print meant you actually put ink on pages. And now I'm more or less primarily a radio person. And if you had asked me 25 years ago, you know, which medium I would prefer to be in, which one that I would be better at, I would have told you writing is my thing. And I don't know, I think radio might be my thing. I think we can all find these things as the medium changes. But we do have to be open to them. And we do have to just tell ourselves and remind ourselves that as bad as things seem, people still trust us. And that's a great place to start.
Yeah, I think maybe I can think about like to what end again. But also we were talking about this, like we were talking of the example of like, I've just published a scientific paper, right? I go to a press officer or my public information officer, hopefully it gets picked up by a press release. But actually AI is also doing these things for us now, right? AI is picking things up and curating things for us. So now if you're a scientist writing an abstract, you might have to consider how you write that abstract so that AI will curate that accurately, right? Which is a whole new kind of thing to think about, which we'll never know for sure because the algorithms are opaque, but it's a whole new, what's the AI going to pick up on, right? And I mean, I think I'm less worried about AI, well, in terms of me using it, just because I think it can be useful, right? But I'm also realizing that I'm probably a more discerning consumer and user of that technology than a lot of people are, right? And so, for example, it's great at giving me a quick overview of this body of literature, sort of, because it's not always accurate. But that means you have to go in and check, right? But also, it's probably not that great because the abstracts are written for human consumption, not for AI curation, right? And so I think about like, well, what does the future hold when we are writing things that can be curated by AI quickly? Does that change how we write scientific papers? Does it change, like abstracts at least, right? Because the algorithms don't have access to something that's behind a paywall. But if it's open, like, does that change how we write something as a scientist? We'll find out.
Lael and I were having this conversation earlier about the word quietly. ChatGPT is a quick addicted to this word quietly. And it uses it so frequently in so many weird contexts. And you have a good example that I hope you'll share in just a second
Yeah.
here, but it uses it so frequently in so many different, like, ridiculous contexts that people now who read writing that is written by ChatGPT are learning subconsciously that that's a word that you put into things. And I haven't done the engram yet, but I can guarantee it's gone through the roof. And I think this is related to this idea of, like, this is going to change the way that we communicate, because now we're both learning from AI and trying to teach AI. And I think both consciously and subconsciously, that's going to have a major effect on the way that we communicate and try to communicate with the world. And it's going to have a major effect also on how people perceive what good communication is. I think many of my students think throwing the word quietly into as many different contexts as possible is good writing, because they are learning now what good writing is from bots. Um, but this is all part and parcel of the thing I was saying earlier, which is that, like things change. We're like, everything's going to change, right? And if we just continue to do the things that we've always done, which is let's be credible, let's be meticulous, let's be as clear as possible, we're still going to be successful in whatever that new era is, I think and hope.
Well, I'll tell my quietly story, and then I have something else to add to that. I use AI to review my writing. So AI writes very badly. If you don't know that yet, just know that. But I do use it to review my writing for style. And yesterday I was writing about tree rings. Justin isn't in here. Tree rings, and it wanted to change a phrase that said tree rings are quietly hiding in the tree. And I'm like, well, it's true, but I did not accept that. Um, one thing I in my mind, so once again, it's a very applied approach. One thing in my mind I keep going back to is, okay, things are changing in honestly in such a fast way that really we can guess at what's going to happen next with communication, but nobody really knows. But human brains work the same. And when I'm working on a piece of communication, usually writing, I think about a conversation. I have an audience. I have a person in my head that I am writing to, or writing the social media post to, or I'm from Utah. I grew up here. I know Utahns well. I think that one of the problems scientists run into is that scientists are trained and get really good at seeming smart to other scientists. That's it's one of their goals. And when they use words that aren't specific, especially students, you guys know this, if they use words that don't have the specificity to reach a certain bar, you're criticized. People think bad things about you. So you start to hear the word with communication, dumbing it down. I hate that. I hate that idea. Um, when so if the point of my communication is dumbing it down, your audience is going to feel that, and they are not going to like you. If in my head I am thinking, oh, I really want this person to understand what this means and why it's important, all of a sudden that changes what I put into the article, what words I use, what acronyms I use or don't use, um, whether or not I'm funny. Like if I want, often I have my mother-in-law in my head who is passed now, but she was came from a farm in Hooper, and was interested in the world, but not necessarily educated. And I want her to understand these things, and I speak in a way that she would like. And I do find success. I think I find success with that. And I'm going to pass this off, but I just wanted to add that, so to what end and what vehicle are you using? So if you answer to what end, if you really want this people to understand this idea, you do end up losing specificity, leaving out a lot of information, leaving out your methods because nobody cares about your methods. And basic science is really hard. It's really hard to get there. But there are some things that I'm sure you can speak more on. A sense of wonder, solving a problem, a sense of curiosity, empowerment about the world are the vehicles that get people sparked about your topic.
So, I don't like the term dumbing down. I'd say make it, oh, sorry.
Sorry, Zoom can't hear you.
Oh, sorry. I'm Marianne Mufuletto. I'm a communication specialist in the College of Arts and Sciences here. Lael mentioned the term dumb down, and I don't like that term either. I prefer the term make it elegant, make it sleek.
One of the things that I tell all of my guests on Undisciplined is that our listeners have a PhD level of expertise in something. And in some cases, it's a PhD in chemistry or it's a PhD in biology. And in some cases, it is a PhD in yoga. It's not an actual PhD in yoga, although I understand there are such a thing. But it's they have a PhD level of expertise in yoga or in the mechanics of fixing Toyotas or in, they have a PhD level of understanding of mowing lawns, whatever it is. They're just as smart as you are. They're just smart in a different way. And so what I tell all of my listeners is what I tell all of my guests is I want you to speak to me and to our listeners like you're speaking to somebody with a PhD in a completely different subject than the one that you earned your PhD in. And this came out of an experience that I had when we launched this show originally. I had this idea that what I wanted to do, and we did this for about a year and a half before COVID happened and it became a little more difficult, that we would take two researchers from vastly different subjects, that we would lock them in a room together and we would force them to talk to each other. And when we did that, these beautiful conversations came up, and they were accessible conversations. Because when you have a PhD in chemistry and you're talking to somebody with a PhD in astrophysics, you still speak at an incredibly elegant, thank you so much for that word, level. But you also speak accessibly. And so that's where that idea came from, was like, it just works. It works. And I think that we can all do that. We don't have to, dumb down. Right? We don't have to, like, people say, oh yeah, make it so a fifth grader can understand it. Don't do that. Don't make it so a fifth grader can do that. Make it so a really intelligent adult human being can understand it, who just has a different background than you. I want it.
I want to pitch an idea for a show, okay?
Are you gonna live?
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm gonna live pitch an idea for Undisciplined just really quick, Ryan.
And by the way, if it's not a good idea, I'm gonna tell her that.
Yeah. But here's what you do. Instead of locking two scientists in a room, you put a scientist and a comedian. And you ask the comedian to ask the scientist oh wait, are you the comedian?
I love this so much. No, I love this so much. So just two episodes ago, we had an author on our show just wrote a book called Stay Cool, which is a book about why comedy is important in the time of changing climates. The funniest thing about that book is that it's not a very funny book. It's a very analytical book about comedy. But we led the show with a clip from the climate comedian Raleigh Williams, who does this bit about how much Exxon loves oil. Exxon loves oil so much that it's donated lots of oil to all of the world's oceans. And then we also had to beep out a bunch of stuff because Raleigh drops so many F-bombs, and like 3/4 of our audience are members of the Mormon Tabernacle Choir. So, but I love this idea. I really love this idea. It actually dovetails really well with this idea that a journalist from Salt Lake City, who is now the managing editor of the Seattle Times, Matt Canham, had, where you take golfers out, but you make their caddies a comedian. And you like the comedian just razzes on them the entire time. But I think we should do that with scientists. I think that'd be great.
Okay. So I'm really curious if you guys could talk a little bit, since we're talking about in the age of TikTok, about like bad actors and fostering engagement. A friend of mine did a presentation recently where he Googled and he looked on YouTube and TikTok with a bunch of pseudoscientific topics and conspiracy theories and everything. And he was just showing like views of the top conspiracy theorist and views of the top debunker. And consistently across the board, Hollow Earth gets more views than the person who disproved it. Flat Earther gets more views. And you know what the only exception was like Neil deGrasse Tyson. He had a really long podcast and it was so many more views than anybody that talked about this interstellar object that might be aliens or whatever, right? And his point was that Tyson, in this example, understands what the bad actors are doing, and he knows story, he has credibility, and he has all of these strategies to keep people continually involved. Whereas many science communicators, Sarah had that that slide where it's just, these are all the facts. This will change your mind. And it turns out that that's not really how that generally happens. And so I really want to know more about your opinions on bad actors, fostering engagement, and how to, or if we should be looking at fostering more engagement and maybe changing strategies.
I think that it's always scary when you see a YouTube video with clear misinformation in it. It doesn't even have to be scientific misinformation, any kind of misinformation. You see that number, right? 1.2 million views or whatever it is. And I think we also have to bear in mind that people consume media for many different reasons, and that just because somebody watches a video that includes misinformation doesn't mean that they believe the video with misinformation, right? Um, and just because something has engagement doesn't mean it necessarily has credibility. So those are like the first things that we have to separate. Now, we also have to accept that there's a really good chance that many of those viewers, especially the ones that are like this, right, believe that to be credible. So we do have to accept that, right? But we can separate those things out a little bit. Even in accepting that, though, there's another thing that we have to take into account, which is just consumer patterns, right? People are looking for information that aligns to what their preconceived beliefs. Okay. And if you are part of the minority of people on this planet, the vast, vast, vast minority of people on this planet who suspect for whatever reason that the earth is actually flat, okay, when you find a video that says that, you're much more likely to watch it. You're much more likely to engage in it. So now we have sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Small numbers of people who are driving up engagement. So I I'm not saying don't worry about that. I don't want to say like it's not a problem. I do think that as scientists, we can and should pick apart problems and look at their smaller elements. And that problem often, when you're just measuring page views, often I think looks bigger and scarier than it is. The vast majority of people on this planet believe the vast majority of science that's happening. Yes, I wish that everybody did. And yes, the numbers, whenever those numbers dip down, it does concern me too. And whenever I see somebody, a new person who's peddling misinformation, very clearly peddling misinformation, starts to gain a following, something sinks in my stomach a little bit. And also I try to remember that like long term, for decades, for generations, we're seeing that people trust science. And so that's like the people who are going like this are a small minority of the people.
Yeah, I'm just echoing a lot of that. I think it's important to parse out audiences. As I was saying earlier, there's a group that is not interested in new information. They want their ideas reinforced. I've given up talking to that group, right? There's a group that already knows what you know, and it's not really that helpful to talk to them. There's this middle group that is open to new information, and that's who I talk to. That's who you have to talk to. Once again, very practical. I've kind of given up on social media. Like there's just so much misinformation out there. It is a losing battle. But there, especially with AI, when I get information out on a credible news source that's bumped up in AI, and it is fed to more people. So I'm not a scientist. I think we're kind of getting to post social media. I think in the next couple of years, we are seeing the end of that sort of influence. But you probably know better than.
You're both very optimistic. First of all, I think your friend's algorithm is done. Just misinformation all the time, anytime that person searches anything. But also, I think when we talk about misinformation, when you call them bad actors, you are ascribing intent, right? Which isn't easy to tell all the time. So I would argue that the anti-vaxxer movement came out of a place that was not ill intent, right? Not ill intent. Okay. That it was parents worried about their children sharing a particular message, even though it was incorrect. So I wouldn't ascribe ill intentions to that piece of misinformation, right? So I think when we think about information that doesn't align with the science, it is misinformation, yes, but disinformation is something different. To ascribe intention to that piece of information or to the producer of that information, sometimes it's obvious, I grant you that, but it's not always obvious, right? And so when we think about that, misinformation is not new, right? Misinformation is not a new phenomenon at all. There's always been inaccurate, incorrect information, even in scientific spaces, right? It's just the ways in which we share them now are different. And then there's AI generated misinformation, right? Like AI generated images, content, whatever. I think a really big challenge with this, so Flat Earth, for example, is a good one because there's a documentary called Behind the Curve, if anyone has seen it on Netflix. It's a great documentary because it actually talks about a group of engineers who are out to test the Flat Earth hypothesis. And they're very scientific about it. They have, advanced degrees in engineering, and they run experiments, right? Which, as you might imagine, fall flat on their face and don't find support for their hypothesis. And that's where the scientific process breaks down, right? They don't find support in what they say, oh, well, my measurement instrument is broken. Not, right? So that's the rationalization part. But really what they are trying to do and what the documentary shows is that some of these people are looking for a community, right? And other communities have alienated them and they feel alienated from other communities. And so they have found community in this flat earth group, right? So it's not always about that piece of misinformation necessarily, but there's also social aspects around it, I think, that sometimes can drive people, right, to view these things or otherwise. And then I think in this sort of climate, research on misinformation, it was very, very popular to do research on misinformation about 2 years ago, right? It's probably at the height of its sort of popularity on misinformation, both the spread of misinformation and sort of effective debunking, pre-bunking, those kinds of things, right? It is a really bad time now to be trying to do misinformation research because it is not a well-funded area, right? Because now misinformation research is sort of reframed as censorship, right? And reframed in the ideas of free speech. And so we have a little bit of a challenge and perhaps sort of a perfect storm where there's not a lot of misinformation research going on. There's the rise of AI that can create a lot of new types of misinformation, right? And we don't really know very many effective ways to sort of prevent misperceptions that result from misinformation, nor do we actually know sort of the mechanism by which misinformation causes misperceptions, right? So there's a lot that we don't know that I think we are making a lot of assumptions about, and that we get sort of very morally panicked about when we see misinformation online. I don't know. Again, I'm sure some of it is because some of our priors lend itself to us believing that misinformation, right? And that we've sought it out anyway, you know? And so there's definitely like the far end groups that may never change their mind.
I'm curious. So I'm big on conversation because I believe in empathetic communication, where you can look at a person, ask them questions, find out what their needs and fears are, respond, change your message. I'm curious if you guys or anyone has had a conversation with someone who believed very differently than you did that went well, and why. Yeah.
Thanks, Lexi. Very excited to hear this.
All right, so in a lot of my work, I use a tactic that we call the side door. And so first off, just hang out with the person and ask them, like, hey, show me your land, show me your creek, show me your farm. You know, what do you know? Like, what's unique about this? And just sort of put myself in a position of active listening first, and just really show that I'm willing to respect whatever expertise they have. An example of this would be there is a rancher in Nevada for generations, starting with his grandpa. When he was a kid, he would go fishing in their creek off the beaver dams and beaver ponds with his grandpa. And then the Army Corps of Engineers came in and said, hey, the modern way to do this is to channelize your stream. So they channelized the stream, and of course it downcut 12 feet in 1 year, and all the beavers went away and died. And he has been the head of the Nevada Cattlemen's Association. He is like a dude's dude. But he started to notice in some of the worst drought years where the beavers came back, the water came back, the cows, I mean, duh, it's all the things beavers do, and I study beavers. But he still thought that climate change was an Obama hoax. And so I was there with some of my students from Whitman College. We were filming, talking about ranchers that are letting beavers come back and natural, solutions to coexistence. And my students immediately wanted to start arguing and show them everything they knew about, no, climate change, climate change. And I was just like, we don't need to do that. And so I started just asking him, like, hey, you said it's a really bad drought year, and like the summer is much hotter than it used to be. Tell me about that. Oh, wow, you don't get nearly as much snow. Tell me about that. And so we were able to just circumvent the thing that was the obstacle that wasn't really the point, and get to the point that was the point, which was, oh, wow, when we coexist with nature and support natural solutions, it can actually help us in these times of changed weather. But since then, we've kept in touch. 10 years later, I got my friend at the New York Times to write a whole story about him, and he's using the word climate change now. So that kind of thing, just find the side door. Think about, is what you're arguing about really the most important thing? Can you circumvent it? Can you find something in common? Can you build baby steps and baby steps and baby steps? And like, what can I show him that I learned from him? And I respect him and I trust him, and then go from there. So that's my shtick as a filmmaker.
I mean, this is a little bit what the SIM Ambassador program is about, right? Building a relationship that doesn't necessarily have to start with science right away, just a relationship about something else, something that we have in common. That's why the ambassador, the scientist, gets to pick their group, right? It could be, I love gardening. I want to start there. And then we can talk, right? I mean, I think about this too when I go to conferences. When I go to conferences, I have to admit, I rarely talk about my science, right? I get to know my colleagues and I get to know them as people. And then maybe later we'll talk about science, but it makes that conversation better. It makes that conversation less of a fight if we have opposing views, right? Because we now know each other and have some relationship. And so we build some relationship before we ever get to the fighting about it and, fighting about whatever concepts.
You fight nice.
I just want to add something I forgot. You'd mentioned curiosity and you'd mentioned wonder. There's a great storytelling professor, Bobette Buster, who calls awe the sixth sense
Absolutely.
and how there are actual studies that show when we come to a place of awe, we sort of become less combative and we automatically become more open to new ideas. So intentionally going somewhere beautiful or going out with the sunset or seeing baby animals or anything that sort of puts people's guards down, I think is also just really helpful to get to that space of shared awe as tiny little humans and then go from there.
I think we've been wired to debate people. Every high school in America has something called debate team. Not a single one has something called cohesion team, you know? And I think that because of that wiring, we hear something that we disagree with and we go, and that we know it's not true. And we go, I need to fix that problem. And if I can dunk on that person too in the meantime, that'd be great. And I I just think that that doesn't need to be the way, both because it's not effective. It's an incredible expenditure of energy for not a lot of return. If people have a hardened belief, you're going to spend a whole lot of hours trying to convince them. You're not going to be successful. And in the meanwhile, all these other people that we were talking about earlier who aren't those people could be experiencing awe, could be being told a story, right? And we've just wasted all this energy on this small number of people who aren't going to change their minds anyway. Um, I think one of the third ways also is being useful. And this is my very, very favorite story to tell about being a useful climate scientist. As a few years ago, I came upon a connection, a really robust connection between a shift in sea surface temperatures in the far eastern equatorial Pacific and wheat harvest yields in Kansas 2 and 3 years later. And correlation is not causation, but we identified a potential mechanism and we published on this. And then I called the Kansas Wheat Commission and I said, I'd like to come out and talk to some farmers, some wheat farmers, so I can understand how they might interpret this and how they might use this. And they said, okay, well, you want to talk to Jay? It's like, okay, so I flew out to Kansas and I drove out to Muscatah, Kansas. And Jay came and met me in the parking lot of his very large wheat farm and has got hands like the size of baseball gloves. He's like, hey, welcome. And he goes, so they tell me you're a journalist and a climate scientist? And I said, well, yes, sir, that's right. And he goes, I don't like either of you. And I just love that so much because I knew where I stood immediately, right? That's so good. That's so good. And so we go into his office and Jay's got all of this Make America Great Again paraphernalia behind his desk. Like in my mind's eye, I don't remember for sure, but in my mind's eye, he had like more pictures of Donald Trump than his grandkids. And we're sitting there and we're chatting and he's peppering me with all of these questions. And it's a what's what of all of the greatest climate denying things, right? He's asking about proxies and instrumentation. And Jay's smart, right? He's done his homework. He's done his own research, they say, right? I'm not arguing with him. I'm not arguing with him. I'm listening and I'm telling him kind of what I know, but I'm not trying to convince him otherwise. And then, after we were kind of done with that conversation, which was 20 or 30 minutes or so, he goes, so what are you doing here? And I said, well, I want to show you something. And so I fired up my computer and I show him how we came upon this connection. And I asked him, like, would you be interested in knowing more about this? Is this something that you think you can use? And he goes, well, if this and this and this, then yeah, I mean, like more information is better. I farm better today because I have more information than my pappy did and my grandpappy did. So if this is more information and what you're telling me is true, then yeah, I could use this. And we, after we're done, after a couple of hours of chatting and, he takes me out into his farm and we ride in the combine together. And, he takes me back out to my car and he shakes my hand again and he goes, I think I like you just fine now. Because I was useful. It wasn't because I convinced him that I was right about climate change. It was because my particular expertise was something that he could use to potentially improve his yields.
I would argue it's probably also because you were warm and demonstrated that you had his best interests in mind. And so not just, right, like a lot of that conversation part is about warmth and humanizing and relationship building as opposed to just like, I'm not just useful, but I happen to also give you useful information.
I think we often want to go straight to social media and writing because it's the fastest way to communicate. But I think in the world we live in, we have a slog ahead of us. I think it's just inevitable that if we want people to really understand the value of science and what actions they need to take, we have to be having 100 of these conversations. And then we have to get to know and like and appreciate and love the people who think differently than us, which is really hard in this world. But I think that's I think that's the only way to do it.
Right there. Thank you.
Thank you.